somewhat in these sorts of contexts, maybe unconventional presentation where really I decided to sort of raise some bigger picture questions about the whole sort of field of mental health services and global mental health, rather than more of a sort of targeted discussion about where things are at vis-a-vis homeless services and services for people with significant psychiatric or psychosocial disabilities. I really want to kind of, I suppose, reassure people or sort of distance myself from the sort of the stereotypical academic who is sort of whose work is just sort of divorced from what's happening in the real world, or the kind of real struggles of people living in conditions of poverty and struggling with disability and mental illness, and say that really my motivation for doing kind of asking deeper theoretical questions and philosophical questions really comes actually very much from sort of a lifetime of immersion in sort of very kind of structurally disadvantaged, and I say this knowing that in a global context, no American actually can sort of claim global structural disadvantage within a domestic context. I think it's fair, and where I go with that is really kind of running up again and again against what often seem to be kind of insurmountable problems with the status quo way of doing things, and that has always motivated me in the direction of we need to be doing things fundamentally differently. We need to be asking fundamentally different questions. And so that is sort of the orientation here. I'm covering some very kind of complicated big picture issues in the course of 20 minutes. And so I've been very selective in what I chose to highlight. There's so much more that could and really should be said and discussed about kind of all of the issues that I raise here. 3 issues that I want to sort of ask us to think more deeply about are, first, what it really means, what it would take for us to engage with the kind of the deeper and more complicated social, ethical, and political challenges that are sort of in fact implicated in the development and evaluation or testing of interventions and services and supports for marginalized populations in general. But here we're really talking about homelessness and serious psychosocial disability and their intersections with other forms of kind of social disadvantage and discrimination. Disrupting policies, second, that have historically marginalized those on the receiving end of services. And in some way, I'm going to say less here because I think this is sort of part and parcel of interrogating the status quo in terms of how we develop and evaluate things conventionally and in sort of the research and policy mainstream. And third, sort of, kind of what it would mean, or how we begin to sort of actually start addressing major structural determinants of homelessness and disability, including gross income inequality. And we sort of talk about this in sort of any textbook nowadays on, kind of mental health, public health is going to acknowledge social and structural determinants, but that doesn't mean that that there is a more kind of fundamental reorientation in terms of actions that we're taking and ways that people in this space, future leaders in this space, are being trained. So I want to sort of start with a little bit of a very, very partial and selective kind of history of evidence-based medicine and implementation science. Again, I could tell a much more probably kind of nuanced and careful story, and that would have taken kind of a significant amount of time. The originary intentions of evidence-based medicine, which has now come to dominate the global landscape. So whether we're talking about kind of funded projects in India, in Uganda, in the US, there's a dominance of this sort of language and discourse of evidence-based medicine. When we look at kind of the kind of early development and thinking behind it, it really in a way I think most of us, if not all of us would agree with, was meant to be a corrective and a safeguard against practices grounded really more in ideology or dogma than kind of a careful kind of grappling with kind of actual real world impacts and effects. So, for example, if we look at practices in state institutions for people with disabilities and mental illness, and this is not, all that different in different parts of the world, there's these just kind of terrible legacies of how people have been, and in most cases still are, treated in institutions. But if we go back 30, 40, 50 years, we see really kind of profoundly problematic practices. And if we go back farther in time, prefrontal lobotomies. And so it's sort of these sorts of things that kind of evidence-based medicine and evidence-based psychiatry, are trying to guard against. But the sort of the consolidation of evidence-based medicine and what that means and how that's operationalized, intensely political like anything else. And in spite of the language of evidence-based, which is relatively generic, broad, potentially pluralistic, evidence-based medicine in many ways is not very pluralistic. In fact, has sort of developed and settled and sedimented around a set of norms that are actually very prescriptive, and I think one might argue very narrow. So first of all, there is this sort of reliance on an articulation of evidence hierarchies, and those evidence hierarchies tend to place randomized controlled trials and then kind of systematic review and meta-analyses at the top. Qualitative research is extremely kind of subjugated and subordinated, right? Like sort of at the bottom of more conventional evidence-based medicine hierarchies. And user experiences and user critiques, and so sort of where kind of philosophy and ethics come in, well, often they don't even sort of appear in visualizations of evidence hierarchies. So this is actually sort of a very narrow way of thinking about what constitutes evidence, and therefore what it is that informs practices that really sort of further not only improved outcomes, but sort of the deeper values that many of us, most of us probably hold. There is a elevation of particular kinds of causal claims and causality established, again, in a very narrow way. So through most often clinical trials that end up very divorced from kind of the messiness of the real world, whether we're talking about real world people and their quote unquote, kind of comorbidities and intersecting experiences of oppression. And there is a kind of an unbounded complexity to our experiences and to disadvantage and oppression and all its vectors that is, in my experience, never really sort of captured by the randomized clinical trial approach. And so it's a particular kind of narrow kind of causality that we often end up pursuing. And there's a de facto, so this is not necessarily explicitly stated, sometimes it is, but there is a centralization and elevation of consensus rather than difference. And evidence-based medicine or evidence-based psychiatry, clinical guidelines and algorithms like for prescribing are really based around the idea that there is essentially one right way to go and you follow that. And because there is, in fact, kind of so much evidence of various kinds out there, real world clinicians, whether physicians or psychologists or social workers, in many ways default into simply sort of following kind of a view of best practices or evidence-based practices and how to implement them that has been laid out for them without them as individuals actually kind of understanding the complexities in many cases of that evidence base and its gaps and oversights. And that's, of course, what I really worry about. And then, there's sort of been a period globally of sort of dominance of evidence-based practices in mental health. And yet we have seen that not translating into real-world practice. And so this is sort of how implementation science emerged as sort of the new hero who we know XYZ works. There are these barriers in real-world settings, whether that is lack of buy-in from the organizations or entities or providers in question, whether it's structural barriers, we need to address them. But for the most part, there's no kind of fundamental questioning built into that of those kind of underlying or referent evidence-based practices. And I would make the point that sort of end users, service users, people with psychosocial disabilities who are kind of receiving the interventions in question tend to drop out almost entirely in implementation science because the focus is so strongly on, we already know this thing works, we just need to make it work in this setting, this new setting, this real world setting, this community setting, as opposed to, is this really the right thing? Say more about sort of concerns, I think, that we find kind of on the ground and why, while we see ostensibly kind of successful instances of sort of the implementation of evidence-based practices, there's also a lot of concerns held on the ground. Legitimate, right? Legitimate concerns. So if we're thinking about clinicians and individuals, the reality of what is being kind of experienced at the level of services, right? Both parties are sort of, and family members and social networks are just on a daily basis faced with decisions that are at the level of individuals or individual families and networks, not the sort of probabilistic thinking of a clinical trial. So the fact that, kind of 60% of people did better and 40% didn't, and that might play some role in trying to figure out how to navigate the kind of complex problems and circumstances we find ourselves in, or a clinician finds themselves in vis-a-vis, a client or service user that they're trying to help. There is so much more going on there than is in any really sort of direct sense informed by single discrete clinical trials. The primary outcomes on which those best practices or evidence-based practices were determined may not matter at all to the individual. So if I don't particularly care, for example, about kind of leaving behind the symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia, and I don't mean just taking myself as an example, or just a random person who that's not their priority, but instead it might be being accepted, it might be a certain kind of freedom to be in the world in a different way, it might be that their experiences in fact are kind of very strongly aligned with what might be considered by others to be sort of extreme spiritual beliefs. So there's kind of a fundamental logic at play that assumes that huge groups of people, and then we generalize from one setting to the other. So we develop some intervention in the United States, and then we export it to India or Ghana in a really problematic way, assumption that those outcomes are what really matters and what matters kind of regardless of location. And I think from the clinical perspective, I think there's a real struggle, a much deeper and more complicated struggle with figuring out what it truly is that the client in front of them needs and wants. Because human beings are also sort of complicated in kind of psychological and psychodynamic terms, and internalized oppression is a very real thing, and internalized stigma and internalized lowered self-expectations. So sort of just this, we take somebody at a, kind of slice in time, and think, okay, well, we ask them what their goals are, these are their goals. But have we had a conversation about kind of deeper things like poverty or discrimination, maybe along other, non sort of disability lines? So whether that is about caste or gender or their intersections, or a history of sex work or sex trafficking, or pregnancy outside of marriage. So there's so much potentially going on, and it's often kind of not just crystal clear how to proceed or what the goals are if we're really engaging with these kind of complex circumstances and intersections. And good clinicians, this is what I almost always hear from, who are not academics, who are not working in academic contexts or doing research. And so they wonder, what do these RCTs and these meta-analyses, what does this research really kind of do for me or do for my client? And it's often very, very unclear. And then I think kind of justified resentment and concern can arise when particular practices, sort of irregardless of the structural biases that have been, in a sense, baked into them, are then imposed by academics or bureaucrats. So I will hear people who are really providers who are really struggling on the ground to figure out how to meet kind of complex needs of a local, kind of local population group, and, really feel angry and frustrated when sort of individuals sort of divorced from those on the ground realities, hundreds or thousands of miles away, are kind of calling the shots. And these are not good power dynamics. I mean, these are not, in my opinion, the good kind of power dynamics. And they play out on multiple levels. So they play out within domestic national context. They play out globally, and we know that sort of power is very unequally distributed around the world. And so Anglophone high-income countries with a history of kind of still being colonial powers, exercise sort of disproportionate kind of power in terms of directionalities of interventions originating in one place, kind of being exported or sort of kind of thrust upon communities and individuals in another. But it also plays out domestically, and it's complicated at this point in time, at this point in the sort of the history of globalization, because we have such a long kind of colonial history at this point to deal with. And so nothing is like kind of clean and simple and straightforward. And then underlying structural determinants, even when they are acknowledged, even when they're always there in the textbook, easily end up buried in the rhetoric and sort of the centering and foregrounding of these quote unquote interventions that work and just need to be scaled. So if we look at kind of poverty as a major underlying issue, and I'll say a bit more about this, but we're very rarely talking about in the mental health services space structural interventions designed to really do something about the poverty in which a very, very kind of substantial percentage of people with serious mental illness kind of live and are kind of forced to live. And instead, we focus on kind of narrower clinical issues or sort of administrative bureaucratic issues, like we have moved a person who is homeless into into housing, but have we addressed their poverty, the poverty that they're faced with in any deeper way? So even when it's not explicit, where there's no sort of explicit goal that we are not addressing structural determinants, the way that we sort of champion many kinds of evidence-based practices as solutions is in fact functioning, I think, to draw our attention away from, and in some sense kind of decenter these very kind of difficult realities that we actually need to be facing if we really want to make a deeper difference in people's lives. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I mean, I don't want to kind of sound completely unbalanced in the way I'm presenting things. So there is discourse around and kind of conversation and discussion, real work happening, including in development and international development, around community developed practices, practice-based research, and then sort of this idea of the continuous learning system where top-down kind of imposition of particular structured or semi-structured practices is not the way forward, but instead that we're constantly learning from what is happening on the ground, making adaptations large or small, learning from those adaptations, and that sort of over time we improve things this way. And these are all really important, kind of areas and sort of, approaches to these problems. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that the local in and of itself does not necessarily solve problems of power and inequality. And we know that pretty much everywhere we go in the world, people with serious mental illness, quote unquote, or psychosis or schizophrenia are the sort of objects of pretty intense kind of social exclusion. And then we look at kind of other forms of social inequality, which varies from place to place, whether it is caste as in, kind of the Indian South Asian context, gender, sexuality and sexual orientation, class, socioeconomics, particular histories of what one has experienced, right? So the ways in which people become very marginalized if they have been sort of trafficked or have engaged in sex work or have been incarcerated or imprisoned, right? So these sort of stigmas that attach, there's sort of nowhere we go in the world where we don't find these things, although they take different forms. And those happen and play out in local contexts as much as they do in kind of global contexts or at more macro levels. And the local in and of itself does not necessarily guarantee that we are asking questions with the depth needed, in part because of these hierarchies. So even in a very localized context, we may find that sort of the local power players are sort of not positioned in a way that takes seriously the sort of claims and concerns, for example, of the local Dalit community in a South Asian context. And so even though it's local, there are these complexities of power that play out, and kind of transformational thinking is very difficult in general, whether locally or globally. Thinking differently than how we have been taught to think is very, very hard. And I think is sort of almost a sort of a lifelong practice of kind of questioning and almost a sort of an attunement to or feelings of kind of anxiety and concern whenever one starts to feel that something is the solution, like almost this sort of recognition of like, this is a red flag. It's a lot of work to remain in this space of sort of deep questioning of what we're doing, what oneself is doing, and again, difficult at all levels, locally as well as at more macro levels. Bringing this back to kind of homelessness and serious mental illness specifically, we know that we have ended up through sort of status quo mainstream approaches with really kind of a plethora of interventions. Many of them, in fact, hold or, result in extremely high rates of disengagement. When we look at the real world, when people are paid to participate in a clinical trial, even there are often kind of high rates of disengagement. But then you move to the real world and it gets, even dicier. And many of those who disengage with serious mental illness end up on the street. So I think where we see kind of a pathway to homelessness for at least a subset of people is really a disconnect and fundamental disalignment between the way that they have been treated or the way that what it is they are struggling with has been framed and their own kind of position vis-a-vis those experiences. And we don't ask those questions. We don't do that work in general. There are exceptions, but certainly the mainstream of kind of homelessness and mental health services research is not grappling with the deeper questions of why people actually vote with their feet and leave the services that sort of many of us would think are the sort of the solution. And then I think another piece of this is that in kind of contemporary medicalized approaches to psychosocial disability, deeper questions about kind of the role and the stakes of identity and processes of identification and belonging are so rarely asked. We assume that the thing is that people want to just kind of ameliorate or reduce their symptoms, and whether we approach that through kind of behavioralist or cognitivist therapies or medications. And we don't think about the deeper ways of what it means to kind of be a person, in many cases experiencing ongoing kind of mental difference, and mental difference is fundamental to the self, in a world in which that is so often excluded and rejected, and which then crosses over into all these other kind of issues and topics. As anybody who has worked with people experiencing psychosis knows, often sort of these people's kind of beliefs and experiences in these contexts sort of kind of blend or merge with deeper political questions. So we think about kind of paranoia with respect to surveillance kind of societies and mechanisms, with respect to police states, and these are real things that are kind of playing out in people's experiences. Or, kind of trauma and disenfranchisement and discrimination, or going in another direction, kind of religious and spiritual kind of extreme beliefs and states. And all of this is a lot blurrier than I think we often make it out to be in this field. And so because we are not diving into that, again, we have sort of really narrowed the field in terms of a whole host of kind of a priori decisions, not by people kind of actually ending up in these social situations or with these experiences, about kind of what matters and what it means to take things forward. The second one, and I really think this is in a way sort of secondary and part and parcel of what I'm talking about, is that status quo practices kind of have not only historically, but still in what constitutes mainstream practice, end up marginalizing those on the receiving end of services, their perspectives, their claims, their complications. And we really need to think about what it would mean to kind of disrupt that in a more significant way, not simply kind of bringing people in as advisors to incrementally improve on decisions that in effect we have already made, that those in power have already made about what the outcomes are that matter, have already designed the interventions, and it's very limited, most often, the way that we sort of bring in service recipients or end users. And then kind of going back to structural determinants, and I think the kind of final phase of Martin Luther King Jr.'s career in the United States, so big civil rights activist in the US, was actually kind of work oriented towards kind of socioeconomic, not just reform, but really kind of transformation. And so this is a quote from 1967, We have moved into an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. We are still called upon to give aid to the beggar who finds himself in misery and agony on life's highway. But one day we must ask the question of whether an edifice which produces beggars must not be restructured and refurbished. That is where we are now. Well, unfortunately, if that is where we were in 1967, this is still where we are in 2022. So it's not just, we have an awareness of the structural issues, but to reiterate what I was saying before, we are not necessarily taking action. We have not necessarily rethought the way that we train social workers, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, community health workers, and kind of other frontline kind of providers. We have not necessarily rethought what are the implications here for sort of the whole enterprise of research. I don't want to just problematize without offering any way forward. And so in kind of concluding this talk, I ended up thinking a lot about the work of Chantal Mouffe, who is a Belgian kind of political theorist, who has really kind of put forward this idea that what we need is not a sort of liberal consensus-based, kind of way of thinking about and conceptualizing democracies, but and what she calls it kind of an agonistic political framework. So let me just read this quote. A well-functioning democracy calls for a confrontation of democratic political positions. If this is missing, there is always the danger that this democratic confrontation will be replaced by a confrontation between non-negotiable moral values or essentialist forms of identification. Too much emphasis on consensus together with aversion towards confrontations leads to apathy and to a disaffection with political participation. In a truly pluralist democracy, disagreements about how to interpret shared ethico-political principles are not only legitimate but also necessary. They allow for different forms of citizenship identification and are the stuff of democratic politics. And I want to suggest that all of this applies to these fields of kind of homelessness and serious mental illness and mental health services. That rather than this narrowing that kind of historically has happened within the kind of evidence-based medicine and what we consider to be kind of good research or rigorous research, defined and understood in a very narrow way and very hierarchical way, whether it is the sort of top-down approaches to implementation, whether it is the sort of top-down neo-colonial politics of interventions developed in kind of high-income Western countries being sort of exported to low and middle-income countries. All of these things they're very narrow, they're very linear, they're very kind of consensus-driven, or sort of this totalizing idea of there is one way, we have to find the one way, albeit for different issues, different interventions, but overall it's very kind of not open and porous to the value of kind of contestation and real differences of agreement about, or differences of perspective on how to move forward that stem from truly diverse positionalities. The difference in perspective between somebody who's experienced homelessness for long term and does not see conventional solutions as the way forward, and somebody who maybe does, both motivated to sort of help and change things for the better. I just want to then conclude by saying that if we took that seriously, I actually think that would be rather kind of a sea change in how things are done. Because I'm not just talking about at conferences here and there, people debate the way forward. I'm talking about how we would sort of build this acknowledgement and recentering of difference and disagreement and the reasons underlying that, the differences in positionalities, the differences in kind of where people fall along different power hierarchies, in the context of methods, in the context of policy, in the context of implementation. And that is not where we currently are now.